Welcome to the podcast, Congress to Cubicle. We're here with Chris Mihm, who's the managing director of strategic issues at GAO. I don't know if they call you the father or the grandfather of the high risk list, but so we're
one of those. But not the grandfather, but one of those that was there near the beginning, but not the actual beginning. So maybe the great uncle. I'll go with that.
There you go. I'll give you that. So we're going to talk today about the high risk list and how do you get on it, how do you get off of it, why it matters, and see what we can do about it. So for our listeners, Chris, can you start out, just tell us what the high risk list is?
Yeah, well, first, Steve, it's a pleasure to be with you here today. Is that the high risk list are those federal programs, functions, and operations that we think are either most vulnerable to waste, fraud, abuse, mismanagement, have enormous consequences to the public's health and safety and well-being if they fail, or program areas that are in need of broad-based transformation. And so it covers a variety of different topic areas, but they're basically the big ticket items that the federal agencies and Congress need to keep an eye on.
So at the current list, there's about 35 programmatic areas on there, and some are very broad, like human capital management. Some are specific to an agency program. How do you decide what goes on the list?
Yeah, it's the we actually have a criteria that we've published on that back in the early part of the century, 2001, in which we lay out for the public exactly how we go about deciding that, and it's available on gao.gov is the criteria. And what we did is we look at basically the nature of the risk, how big it is, and the consequences associated, the dollars associated with that. We don't put things on there that are just a couple of million. We're interested in kind of billions of dollars at risk. And then, as I mentioned, the extent to which the risk to waste, fraud, and abuse or mismanagement, or just fundamental problems with the safety, well-being, and security of the American people. Those issues, though, that you mentioned about, for example, strategic human capital management, are those that are those areas that are in need of fundamental transformation. So, for example, that's not on there because there's a improper payments issue, with the strategic human capital management. It's more of a focus of, if we don't get that right, and in many cases across government, we have not gotten that right, we're not going to be able to deliver effective programs and services on behalf of the American people. In fact, strategic human capital management is its own high risk issue, but it's also a root cause of about half of the other issues that are on the high risk list. And so they're on there because of a critical skills gap, at least in part. And so that's one area that we really need to be making progress across the board. Cyber is another area that's on there that's a government-wide issue. And so there's a variety of them that are on there for that reason.
So solving human capital management issues on a broad scale can solve a lot of issues, of course.
Absolutely. I mean, and we need better planning for the types of people we need and the types of skills. We need better personnel systems and structures that are fit for purpose with the nature of the work that the federal work that's being done today. And we need better tools and techniques on behalf of that agencies use. And OPM obviously has a central role on that. And that's why they're the focus of the government-wide issue.
And as you know, we made a set of recommendations late last summer for the new administration as well as Congress to look at the strategic transformation of human capital management, and they're starting to take that up now, and hopefully we'll see some movement. So with the high risk list,
Steve, just to quickly comment on that, I hope so. I thought your paper was incredibly thoughtful and really lays out a good roadmap for the Congress and for those of us that are analysts that study this as we think about how do we take strategic human capital management and genuinely make it strategic going into the future. So thank you for the work that you did on that. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Well, that's okay. You're welcome. This is a conversation. Obviously, there's many more issues on the list than just human capital management. But so what does Congress do with this report every 2 years when it's published?
Yeah, and we issue it every 2 years, and we've done it since the early 1990s, every 2 years to coincide with each new Congress coming in. And so the next one will be coming out just within the next several weeks, February, March, some time frame in that. We're still working with our clients on the Hill on that. They use that to help set their oversight agenda, both for the committees that have kind of government-wide responsibility, as well as for individual committees that so that they can follow up on the particular high-risk issues that are within their jurisdiction. And so it's a really important tool, one of many inputs, obviously, that they have, but an important input that they have is they're thinking about what are the issues that they need to be focusing on over the next couple of years. Where can they really get traction in helping to work with agencies to improve the delivery of products and services? And there's been enormous progress that's been made because of that. I mean, Congress each kind of high risk cycle passes numerous pieces of legislation to help agencies address their high risk issues. In some cases, it's government wide legislation, for example, that dealing with project management. In some cases, it's very agency specific legislation that helps address a high risk issue. And so Congress is, takes a very active role, and we're very pleased to see that on addressing high risk issues.
Have you seen situations where the agency knows it's a high risk issue? Their hands may be tied from a budget perspective or a resource perspective, but then Congress, by doing the high risk and Congress paying attention to it, you've gotten them what they need, and they've been glad about that. It's really helped them progress.
Yeah, and in fact, we've even had circumstances where, a little bit off the record, that agencies have told us, hey, wouldn't be bad, we wouldn't fight you too hard if you put us on the high risk list, or when we do, they'll say, hey, we were kind of expecting that this would be coming, that because it does give the issue a degree of visibility. Now, I mean, many of these issues, you go through the high risk list, they're not brand new, and they're certainly not new to an agency. It's not as though they're going to slap their head and say, oh my goodness, I didn't know we had a skills gap, or I didn't know that benefits programs were a problem at VA, or Indian programs were a problem. They just haven't had the visibility and attention that they've needed, either very often within the agency or within the Congress. What the high risk list does is fundamentally help to elevate that attention and make sure, and with our work, make sure that there's a consistent focus on that and a consistent conversation about how do we address these high risk issues. Because since they've been widely known, the big problem that we often see is even the solutions in some cases are known. It's just a failure of implementation, a failure to take action and make sure that we actually address the root causes, well, identify and then address the root causes of the high risk issues. That's the big breakdown. And the agency certainly appreciate any help that they can get in that regard. Well, I don't know, appreciate it if I should go that far. They're willing to acknowledge, at least off the record, that they appreciate that.
Oh, that's good. So what the 2 years between publication of the new list, what does GAO do? Is there, working with the agencies, monitoring, testifying on the Hill? What's going on in those 2 years?
Yeah, yes, and yes to your questions. There is that there's working with the agencies, there's monitoring, there's testimonies. In the actual high risk report that comes out, the one that will come out in the next few weeks, there's not a lot of brand new work in there. In fact, there's very, very little new work that's done exclusively for that high risk report. Rather, all the work that goes into that is work that we've been doing over the last couple of years. And so agencies have seen it, agencies have had an opportunity to respond to it. We've made recommendations in those reports. What this, in a sense, summary or capping report does is bring together a lot of that work. So over the 2 year period, we'll in each of the 35 high risk areas be doing continuing monitoring, and in many cases, just given the size of the issues, more than one audited at any given time at that agency on those issues. Likewise, at the same time, we're also doing work across the rest of the federal complex, and we're considering as to whether or not something should emerge as a high risk issue, either to be put on out of cycle or to be put on in the next high risk list.
So is there, you mentioned the criteria to get on the list and all the work that goes on. Is there a decision-making process? Is, the analysts bring an issue that meets the criteria? Is there an advisory board? Does the Comptroller General get involved? How do you actually get onto the list?
Yeah, there is a very disciplined process that we go through on this, because we want to keep true to the criteria that we ended up publishing, and the ultimate decision, of course, is of the Comptroller General based on input and advice that he gets from his staff, that Gene Dodaro, the Comptroller General, gets from the staff. Basically, what the first step would typically be is that someone in one of the mission teams, and GAO is organized in a variety of mission teams that are topically or agency focused, will approach my team on high risk, or we'll see something and approach one of the teams there and say, hey, we think that what we're seeing here, what we're seeing based on your work, is something that may emerge as a high risk issue. We'll also periodically just go out and in general across GAO and say, as we're getting ready to do the update in a year or so, are there issues that you see that are worthy of high risk? We then put together a decision paper for for internal discussion in the Controller General, in which we go through that criteria that I mentioned and make a business case as to whether or not it should or should not be on the high risk list. One of the other things that's an important consideration for us is we look at the number of recommendations that we have open and at the agency on that issue. It's many of these high risk areas have been areas where we may have 10, dozens, I don't think 100, but I wouldn't be surprised on some of the very biggest if we would have that. But we'll have a great number of open recommendations. And so we've been working these issues with the agencies. It gets back to that point that I was making, that really what high risk does is help to elevate attention to this. And so sometimes that's an important consideration as well, is to say, we've been identifying this and focusing on this and talking about this. We need to figure out a mechanism to get a higher level of visibility to that. The high risk is often that mechanism. The ultimate decisions then become, as I mentioned, by the Controller General, usually in the late fall before it comes out. We then obviously give agencies a heads up if they're on the high risk list or if they're remaining on the high risk list.
How does OMB get involved in this?
OMB, it's been unfortunate the last couple of years that we've really lost momentum on that. When Clay Johnson was the deputy director for management over at OMB in the George W. Bush administration, one of the things that he did, and we just thought it was wonderful, he got together GAO, in this case the Controller General, Clay, and at no lower than the number 2 person in the agency, the deputy secretary or deputy administrator for each of the high risk areas. And what they would do is that they would have periodic meetings that in which they would just talk about the status of implementation to address the high risk areas, go over the milestones, go over, do we have the capacity? How are we doing on this? Just to, in a sense, to keep momentum and obviously show Clay's great commitment to that. Those meetings continued on through the administration with the deputy directors for management, OMB, and the Controller General into the Obama administration. I can't say that there wasn't a single one under President Trump, but if there were, I could count them on probably, I wouldn't even need my full hand on that. And I think that's been a big loss, because that's been a loss in momentum. It's been a loss in the highest level of management attention. That's important, not just for the individual high risk areas, but it was also, Steve, critical for those government-wide high-risk areas, where often OMB, even if they didn't own the cross-cutting one, could be a catalytic authority, and obviously being the controller of the budget, could certainly make sure that things kind of got done on that. That's been a big loss. We're hopeful under President Biden that the administration picks those up again, and we'll be reaching out to OMB and obviously the new deputy director for management, if and when he's confirmed. Would
the PMC, the President's Management Council, play a role with this?
Not typically. I mean, I should say, that not formally. I mean, that they would certainly know about the high risk issues, given that the deputies, would have, that are on the PMC, would also have responsibility for high risk issues, or at least transparency over those at their agencies. But most of these were, these meetings that I'm referring to were on a separate track between the DDM and the Controller General and the very senior people at the agencies. And that, just to underscore, that was the real beauty on that. Well, I have staff meetings, my colleagues have staff meetings with senior executives and other teams or other agencies, the program officials, and those are good. Those are very valuable. Nothing is, as kind of clears the mind and clears the agenda than being told, hey, we're going to be down. The deputy secretary needs a briefing because she or he is going down to the old EOP, or EOB rather, next Tuesday to brief on your program. That is getting, that forces, that's a genuine action forcing event, as we would say.
Does it come up on the B side as well as the M side, the budget side versus the management side?
There would be the B side involved in those. I mean, typically, it's obviously the DDM chaired those meetings, but many of the many of these high risk areas need additional capacity. In fact, we have 5 criteria for how you get off the high risk list. Top leadership attention is the first. The second is making sure that you have the capacity, and that is both the people and the resources. And in some cases, you need investments to address these high risk areas. And so you would need the B side involved, and then that's also then gets into the third criteria is you want to make sure that you have an action plan that you're for that capacity, that you're actually using it and using it in a targeted and specific way. Fourth, that you're monitoring the effects of that and making real-time changes based on data. That's a lot what these meetings we're doing. That's what the meetings that I have with my counterparts at the agencies do. And then the fifth criteria is demonstrable results. Are we beginning to start seeing the change? And so back to your point of yes, absolutely. In a number of cases, we do need additional resources, which back to the earlier part of our conversation is also why it's important to involve the Congress on this. It's not just a matter of holding hearings. It's that if there are going to be resource implications, they need to be involved in helping secure that and having then oversight to making sure that those resources actually affect the change that they were intended to.
So you mentioned those criteria and the leadership attention and monitoring and starting to see results. Are agencies really putting effort into getting at least certain programs off the list? I know others have been on the list for a very long time. Like we mentioned earlier, human capital management. That I don't know if that goes back to the beginning, but it's been a very long time, right? So are agencies making concerted effort to really address these things and get them off the list?
I think on the whole they are, although there is certainly more leadership attention that's needed on this. I mean, we had, as I mentioned, the high risk list started in 1990. There were 14 original issues on the high risk list. Many of those have been resolved, but there's some that have been there right from the very beginning that are still on there. Medicare, enforcement of tax laws, DoD weapons acquisition. Those are those real big ones. And, it's hard to see, at least in the short term, them coming off. But there've been 25, 26, 27, somewhere in there, high risk areas that have come off. And in fact, in the last high risk update, we took 2 off: DoD supply chain management and gaps in weather satellites. And in all of these cases, in everything that comes off, it doesn't mean that the risk has gone away and that there's zero risk. It means that it's being effectively managed by the agency, that they have transparency over that, they understand the scope of the problems that they have to address, and that they're working to do that. That's why we say demonstrable progress is the final criteria, not absolute or complete progress or something like that. It also means that we don't go away. We still will continue to do audits on all of these areas. And there have been, cases, personnel security clearances, for example, where an issue went on the high risk list, came off the high risk list, went back on the high risk list because there was some backsliding on that. Strategic human capital management, as you mentioned, has been on there a long time, in this case since 2001. That's, I don't think I'm leaking anything when I say I doubt it will come off in the next update.
We all expect it for sure.
Yeah, that's a tough one. It's just when you have just the government-wide issues that we have across, a whole series of program areas. And then when it's its own root cause of about half the issues on the high risk list, it doesn't mean OPM doesn't own every single one of those agency skills gaps.
No,
that's owned by the agencies. But what OPM does own is the government-wide leadership in making sure that we're thinking about this and working these individual issues in a concerted and dedicated way. That's really where we need to see more progress.
So you take an issue, not necessarily on the list, but improper payments. There's been a lot of progress in a lot of agencies around improper payments. So, and I'm sure GAO also audits and reports on those kinds of things as well. Is that something that can stay off the list and maybe go back on the list if it starts being a problem again?
Yeah, there's a number of agencies that are, or a number of programs that are on the high risk list, in part because of their improper payment rates. And more generally, as you said, we monitor, along with the inspectors general, I mean, they do a lot of this work as well, monitor improper payment rates very, very closely, across agencies. There's, Congress is concerned about that. Obviously, there's statutory requirements, reporting requirements on that as well as OMB. It's also a good example of where zero is not necessarily the issue here. I mean, we certainly recognize that if if we're going to achieve big and important things, that there entails some risk, and some improper payments are going to be associated with that. I mean, it's obviously, we're seeing that with the COVID-19 response. It's just making sure that you have the right balance in place between just taking a current situation, or one that I'm more familiar with because I was more directly involved during the Recovery Act, making sure that you have the right balance between getting the money out, that it gets to those that are in need, while making sure that you also at the same time have a proper set of controls in place, that the money just isn't wasted, or kind of go down the wrong pipe. And so it's that balance, and you're not going to get to zero. I mean, Ed DeSev, when he was working in the vice president's office on the Recovery Act, used to say, I mean, we had very little reported levels of fraud under the Recovery Act, and we know that because, we and the IGs in particular did a lot of audits on that. But Ed's, trick was, he said, and folks, we know how we could have gotten to zero. And immediately you'd sometimes see people picking up their pen. And he said, the way we could have gotten to zero is not spend a single dime. The moment we spend a dime, that's going to entail some risk, and so it's all about, your risk appetite and the right set of balance that you're willing to strike.
So when you look at the current environment with COVID and the vast amount of spending going on that, I'm sure GAO has either started or will start reviewing agency programs, just like the IGs have started looking at programs. That's something that hopefully within a year or 2 years could be gone. So it wouldn't necessarily be something on the high risk list. But when you have a program that's new, that's rapidly stood up, there's an opportunity for being high risk, correct?
Right. Yeah, and then on COVID, under the CARES Act legislation that was passed a year ago in March, that required reports from us every 2 months, and we have been doing those, and those are available on the website, and they're huge, whole of GAO efforts. If it's a whole of government effort to do COVID response, it's a whole of GAO effort to respond to that. And so we've been looking at everything from the rollout of the payments to individuals through IRS, and the problems with that initially, missing certain people, and then, sending checks to those that are deceased, to the rollout of the vaccine, to small business, provisions and other provisions on that. So we've been very focused on that. But as an example of one of the issues that you're talking about, kind of the rollout types, is that typically we're usually in about the 7th year of a decade is when the decennial census will go on the high risk list. Because it's not an issue of fraud, waste, or abuse in that case. I mean, it's I deal with those. I have responsibility for the census portfolio, so I know the technical professionals and the scientists, the data scientists over at the bureau. They're just outstanding professionals. It's just a function of the complexity of taking the census even in normal times, and obviously this last year was the farthest, just about the farthest thing we could imagine from a normal time. So that will go on that went on the high risk list, and and has been on there.
You mentioned a lot of the work that goes into the list is a lot of the good work that the folks at GAO are already doing with program audits and reviews and things like that. Do you get requests to look at certain things from Congress? Do you look at, it was the Coburn book, then the Flake book that looked at overspending and programs that maybe shouldn't exist any longer? Do you look at other sources like that and then go look at programs?
Yes, and in fact, and it gets back to how the Congress uses the high risk list, is that they then use it for their oversight agenda, hearings that they want to have, letters that they want to send to agencies, inquiries that they want to make. At the same time, they also use it to work with us about what sort of audits, which we call engagements, what sort of engagements should they be asking us to do on those high risk issues. It's, as I mentioned earlier, it's that, none of these are particularly new. And so they're often pretty widely known. And so there's an ongoing conversation that we have with our clients on the Hill about what work that we can do that would be best targeting the high risk areas that we can get them off, because that's the measure of my success. I want these things off. I want churn. If someone comes on, I want them out of there. It's and it's meaningful. It just in the last 15 years, And I picked that because that's what I've been most directly responsible for, the high risk list. In the last 15 years, its efforts on high risk programs has saved over $575 billion. You know, as they say, that's getting near real money. And
That's
so,
not
I mean,
chump
that's
change, right? Yeah.
no, that's not chump change. And so there's money out there in financial benefits. There's, improvements in health and safety and well-being. There's risk reduction. There's mutual benefit on the behalf of the Congress and the agencies. And certainly we're part of that equation in addressing these high risk issues. I want them off. I don't want them on there.
That makes sense. And obviously in government, a political environment, you have turnover like we're experiencing now, new nominees coming in, new politicals coming in. But the rank and files that, the SES and the folks that are running the agency below the politicals, this is a new concept for the politicals. So it's in one sense, it's really the career folks on a regular basis you've got to work with, but you also have to bring the politicals up to speed and try to engage them in this process as well. Is that true?
Absolutely. And in fact, when one of the things I worry a little bit about, and obviously given my occupation, I'm paid to worry, so I worry all the time about things, is that one of the things I worry about is the handoff on these management issues, even in the best of times between transitions. And obviously this last one was very far from the best of times. And now each new administration, they come in, they have their own agenda, and they need an opportunity, as they should, to step back and say whether or not they're comfortable on the direction that's being taken for, and I'm speaking exclusively of high risk issues here, on the direction on that. But it's losing momentum is very often one of the big risks that we face, is that and that's why that leadership attention is so important on that, and getting the new leadership team in place, not just at the Senate confirmed, but very often the action takes place at below that, at the and getting them in there, getting good strong relationships and confidence between them and the career staff, which hasn't always been the case in the past, and then getting them comfortable with the direction and keeping the momentum going on these high risk issues. And obviously, being hugely respectful that if they have a different direction they need to take, implementing effectively that direction, along with then making sure that there's an action plan and effective monitoring on the new way to go there. One of the things that we do to try and be helpful on this is not only issue this high risk list, early in the new Congress and early in their tenure, but over the last several years, each year, the Comptroller General has sent a letter from himself to the head of each agency, each of the major agencies, with the priority open recommendations that we have at those agencies. Now, in any cabinet department, and certainly the largest of which, there can be hundreds, or I think even a DoD, we may have over 1,000 open recommendations there. And that's just the nature of how big the agency is and the scope of their responsibilities. What these letters are designed to do is to identify for the head of the agency what are the issues or open recommendations that she or he needs to really immediately focus on. Part of those, or a number of those, are obviously high risk issues, both they're government wide, how they feed into the government wide, and certainly if there are any agency specific ones that would be in the letter that would go to the agency head as well. And so there's a variety of different avenues that we use to try and keep this and get this on the radar screen of the incoming administration, and keep it then on the priority for the agency heads going forward.
Well, that's a job in and of itself, with the size and complexity of government. Any sneak peek you want to give us on the new report coming out in a couple of weeks?
Well, we're still putting it to bed, so I think I alluded to at least one of them that will probably be remaining on there, but I'll have to, we're still in the final throes of decision making on that, so I'm not able to talk a lot about that now. But it is just coming out in the next few weeks, and we'll just need to. Typically, what happens is that there'll be some hearings in front of the Congress, and then obviously all of it and all the details will be available on GAO.gov.
Well, Chris, I really want to thank you for your time. This has been really informative, and I think the audience is going to enjoy this segment in particular as we gear up a new administration and get through that. This is Chris Mihm, the Managing Director of Strategic Issues at the GAO. Chris, thank you very much.
Oh, Steve, it's my great pleasure. It's great seeing you, and thank you for the opportunity to talk with you.
All right. Well, you take care. Thank you.
Thanks.
In our next podcast, we'll have Secretary Shulkin, the former VA secretary, talking about his 10 recommendations for reforming the VA. You won't want to miss it.